So live stream. We're going to record this, guys, so no worries. I'm sharing my my screen to wait. And register. Each other. Say hi. You can write in the chat actually. Sharing my Twitter. Nice. So where are my?
We got a New Jersey. I'm so excited. I've been watching where people are from. I love how whenever you have a webinar or anything online, people automatically start putting in where they're from. I love it. It's so interesting to like see where people are coming from. A lot of USA though.
Hey.
Hi.
Okay.
Hi from Istanbul.
Good to see everyone. We had people registered, like we had almost 400 registrations from 75 countries. So, you know, it's still interesting to see how many countries are represented here live, and there is nothing like the live, right? Okay. Wow, Thailand, Norway, Romania, Slovakia, Vienna, Poland, Kentucky, South Africa, USA, of course, Germany, and Israel. Lots of my students and colleagues from Israel. So excellent.
Oh yeah, there you go. And Nigel is unimpressed. Is that all? That's all you got?
Okay, we're gonna turn off the music, not to bother the background. I know people want to concert. And I see some of my friends, Mike and Eitan, Eli, hi, from Eitan. Hello, good to see everyone. So I'll just give a short introduction. We have already 125. First of all, my name is Elena Mizrahi. I'm from Israel. I teach a course, an international course about international communication in the age of AI. So my students are here from the Technion and my students from other places, because we do this kind of COIL virtual exchange experience for students to collaborate, to meet each other. That's why it's so international. Isn't it fun? So to actually be able to collaborate and talk to each other and explore those interesting AI tools and dilemmas together internationally, while practicing your English skills, communication skills. And we are planning to organize a student-led, student-organized conference in August. We will invite you all to join if you're interested to hear some use cases of actual users of AI, daily users. And so we thought of an idea of inviting Jason, Professor Jason Gulia, right? Is that the right pronunciation? You will introduce yourself in a moment. I just want to mention that I've been following Jason on LinkedIn for quite some time. Really impressed with his innovative and vibe, the way he addresses AI issues in higher education, thinking about how, all of the dilemmas. I don't know, in Israel, we've been gathering in such events and webinars and study days and discussion study days and all roundtables for the past year and a half, very frequently, thinking about what to do with AI. But it's very interesting to hear your perspective, Jason. And we have students here, we have academics. I remember one of your posts, sleep is overrated, about students and academics not being enough involved in those discussions around AI. And I said, no, I can bring the students on board. I can bring academics on board. We can connect and join online and discuss this together. I think it's important. I will also mention that we are running this as part of our international Erasmus virtual exchange project Impact, which is a European funded project that supports collaboration, international collaboration for higher education, students, academics, and improving pedagogy and facilitating virtual exchanges like this one. So we are very, very happy to welcome you all. And I'm going to give the floor to Jason. We still have almost an hour together, so get ready with your questions. And we're so thrilled to welcome you. Thank you so much for joining us, Jason.
Thank you so much, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're coming from. And if you want to keep writing in where you're dialing in from, put it in the chat. One of the things that I'll do as I talk and present, and I talk a lot about AI and higher education and how it all fits together, I think feel free to use the chat as your space. I'm going to try to make that as interactive as I can, knowing that we're at around 140 people or so already, and it might get larger as we go along. So I'll give you some activities to do in the chat, and depending on timing, I'll give everyone a chance to kind of chime in here and there. I want it to be as interactive as possible, recognizing that it's a relatively large group. So what I'm going to do in light of that is I'm going to share my screen and bring up my slides and everything else. Give me 1 second. There we go. And I also want to make sure I share my sound. I always forget to do that, and it always catches up with me.
Excellent.
All right. So, Elena, are we able to see my screen?
All good. Mm-hmm.
All right, cool. Yeah. So this is going to be thinking a little bit about higher education and the age of AI. And there is a lot of thought there, and many of us have probably come across this about what AI is going to do to college, what this means for formal education and informal education, right? We can think about higher education in a bunch of different ways. So what I'm going to do now is I want to start off with you. I don't want to start off dominating the conversation. I actually want everyone in the chat and just write your answer. So in the chat, here's the question. How much, based off of what you've seen, what you've heard, have colleges changed since the release of ChatGPT? So this would have been November of 2022. So if you think they've changed, not at all, put an A, a little bit, put a B, and a lot C. Sorry, not at all A, a little bit B, and a lot C.
I think B is leading.
Yeah. And if you're with me, if you're watching the chat, there is a huge range, a lot of A, B, and C. It seems like the dominant was B. Then I saw some C sneak in. Now A's have kind of overtaken. Cool. But at least for me, and Elaine, I don't know if you're similar, I saw mostly B's. That seemed to be like the letter that popped in there a little bit. And then C's beyond after that. And then A's, I've seen a few of them, but I kind of expected that to dominate. And that wasn't the case, which is awesome. Cool. All right. And so one of the reasons I start off with that is, and a lot of us already know this, higher education is very siloed. So a lot of what we experience, what we see is just based off of our context. So I'm going to give you another question, and this time it's going to be a number. So in the chat, you can kind of stay there. And so this allows everyone to participate regardless of how you're accessing this meeting. But in the chat, my question is, how worried should colleges be about AI? If you think not worried at all, 1, sort of worried 2, or really, really worried to the point of being terrified, put in 3. Mostly 2s I'm seeing, some 1s. I think I saw a couple 3s. Yep, there they are. All right, and feel free if you're still thinking about it or just haven't gotten a chance to write in, continue popping in your answers. I should see them on my window as I talk. So one of the reasons I start off with these exercises is, one, just to focus on the huge range. When we have a question like this, oh yeah, and Orly writes, it depends on what they're teaching. And I think that's so true. So a lot of how we approach these questions depends on where we are, right? This is an international conversation, and it's an international audience that we have with us today. And so it depends on where we are. It depends on our individual institution, and it depends on our discipline. There are some disciplines that have been, really good about adapting and adopting this technology, and then some others that have not. And I'll talk about this in a minute, I teach reading and writing and literature. And we are kind of a little bit closer to the and not part. We haven't adapted in many ways. And depending on what you look at, there's been a lot of resistance for good and for bad. And so I think it's important to have that focus on the range and how context-driven our answers actually are. So who am I? So I am Jason Gulia, and I'm a professor of English and writing at Berkeley College. So I'm based on the East Coast of the US. I'm not the California Berkeley. That's much bigger. We are a small college on the East Coast. So we're in New Jersey and New York. And one of the reasons I care so much is I do care a ton about college. When I went to college, within a few months, I felt like I finally belonged in a school. And I don't, mean that in a really extreme way. I mean that in a very practical way. When I went to schooling, middle school, high school, I didn't like it. Didn't find it engaging. I felt micromanaged. And for me, and I recognize this is the experience for a lot of us, but not all of us, I went to a giant public university. I think of about 30 to 40,000 students. So huge. And for me, that was incredibly empowering. I felt like I had a degree of autonomy. I could do what I wanted to do. I could join what I wanted to join. And for me, my classes were very empowering. And I recognize this might not be that typical. I rarely had lectures. I mostly had, even within that large context, smaller group discussions. That was the focus for me. And so I do think that as we move forward with the age of AI, whatever that looks like, I do think that college, whether we look at the student experience or we look at research, I think it's going to have a huge role to play. Now, I think that, but I also am not sure what that role is going to be. And I think that's what we need to shape. That's what we need to think about. How college is going to fit within the history of AI, or really just the world. Because I do think that, for better or worse, we and our students are moving into this new era when we are interacting with our technology in fundamentally different ways. And that's another reason, just personally, I really, really care about this. I'm a dad. I have a 3-year-old, soon to be 4-year-old, which I cannot wrap my head around, and I have an 8-month-old. And one of the things that I spend a lot of my time thinking about is the world they're going to get, what they're going to be given. And I think that for me, I think about this through my children, but you don't have to. Really, all that this comes down to is really caring about future generations and thinking about how they're going to interact with this technology. And one of the things that I will try to do throughout this presentation is not make everything completely positive or completely negative. I think one of the main ways we need to move forward is to be nuanced and to think about how complex this is. And it's okay, I think, to start there. If you look online, if you look on social media, LinkedIn, Twitter, X, YouTube, whatever, there is something very polarizing about this topic, about AI. You can find people saying it's going to save the world. You will find people saying it's going to destroy the world, and everything in the middle. And I think that the more nuanced we are, the more specific we are, the better we're going to be at adapting to this technology. And I'll talk a little bit about that word adapting later, because it means something different for a lot of us. So in the higher ed space, I really have seen two main trends. And this is based off of what I've read, what I've looked at, and also who I've talked to. So one of the things that I do, so I'm obviously a professor of English. I'm also an AI consultant. So I work with a lot of colleges and universities. I've worked with like 20, 25 of them at this point. And I've learned a lot just by talking to probably thousands of educators and thousands of and I'm trying to figure out what the big trends are. And these are the ones that I've noticed. The first one is recognizing that AI isn't a fad. One of the things that really happened after ChatGPT came out and everyone started using this technology, we'd had it for quite a while, but then suddenly everyone was logging in and using this program, this chatbot. And I do think there was the assumption that it would fade away, that it was going to be with us for a little bit. It was going to be trendy for a few months, and it was going to fade into the sunset, and we were going to go back to normal. And when this happened, when I started to see that assumption in higher ed, I thought about the pandemic. So for me, when the pandemic came, it was going to be a push for education to change. And it didn't. The pandemic kind of faded into the background. Hybrid classes went away. Forms of teaching that we started to embrace in education went away. And a lot of institutions went back to quote unquote normal. They went back to what they were doing during the pre-pandemic. And so my worry was that we had this other push, right? The pandemic was a push, and I don't think it took in most institutions. And now AI was an additional push. My worry was that we weren't giving it the consideration that we needed to give it. And I think that has changed. I think over the last year, especially, that has shifted. As I talk and I read more and, interact with students and professors, I'm starting to see that there's this recognition that AI is going to be around for the foreseeable future. And it's going to be worked into everything. I'll talk a little about that a little bit. And the other trend I've noticed is a skepticism towards easy solutions. One of the reasons that something like AI detection was so attractive early on for a lot of institutions is if you could rely on it, if you could use it, you could just plug it in and do whatever you were doing. You didn't have to change. You didn't have to adapt. And I think there was something so attractive about that because it was a pretty easy solution, as long as you can trust it. I think that's changing. I think that's shifting. I think we're starting to see a more nuanced perspective. And yes, as Elena mentioned, feel free to write in ideas, write in questions along the way. I will work them in. I'll try to get to all of them. If I miss them, I'm sorry. I will try to get them at the end, or you can always send me a message. I'll give you my contact information at the end. You can DM me, all of that stuff. So in other words, to kind of, bring that all together, the needle isn't moving yet, but it's shaking. I think we're at the point where if you can imagine the needle of higher ed, I think it's Bruce writes, can't trust detectors. I'll talk about that a little bit too. So I think the idea was that when AI happened, when all of our students were using it and now professors are using it, that it was just going to start to push things. I don't think it started to move that needle yet, but I do think we're seeing the kind of pre-move jitters. And I think that's important, as I think that now a lot of the assumptions around this technology are shifting. And then if we keep pushing, if we have these plans going forward and these maps going forward, I do think we can push higher education in a productive path. But it's going to take a lot of work. It's not going to happen naturally. We're going to have to find ways to adapt to this technology in a productive way. So I do think things are changing, not as fast as a lot of us would have liked, myself included, but I do think we're seeing the early signs of movement. So I want to take some time and talk about those a little bit. And then I'll give everyone a chance to kind of jump in and, throw their ideas in, whether it's in the chat or anything else. So the trend number one is that AI isn't a fad. And one of the reasons that I think this has changed, right, this transition has happened, is that a lot of our college students are power users of this technology. In the beginning of every summer, and we're starting to see it already, there's all of this cry about programs like ChatGPT dying. It happened last year, starting to happen this year already. And the idea is that there's a dip in usage. But it is not a coincidence that that dip in usage is the dip in, so the start of the summer for a lot of us. Students aren't using it. Our college age students, so 18 to 22 for a lot of them, right? And then everything around that age range, they're using this technology a lot. They're using it in certain ways. And some of them might not even be entirely aware that they're using it. And that has been sort of the push for us, that these are the students who are engaging with technology in a very consistent way. And I think that that is starting to dawn on a lot of colleges. Oh, and Alan, I want to come back to the question of plagiarism a little bit, especially thinking about trend number 2. That is something that is also starting to shift, but it's only in the early stages of it. And the other thing that has happened is that AI is being baked into everything. There was an early idea that a college should identify something like ChatGPT, ban it, and I'll talk about the easy solutions part too, and then just go forward. But then what started to happen was that AI programs and products and companies started to work it across the board. It's baked into Zoom. There is an AI companion. This was mentioned in the comments too. It is baked into Zoom. It is baked into Google Docs. If you go into Google Docs, there's a button that says, help me write. It is baked into Gmail. There's every indication that it's going to be baked into Microsoft Word. Why wouldn't it be? It's worked in across the Microsoft platforms. And as Mark mentioned, it will continue to be baked into more and more things. And it's in Google Maps, as I mentioned. So AI is being worked into programs that our students are interacting with. And they might not even know it's AI. Right? But generative AI is easier and easier to access. And so as a very quick example, Grammarly. Last year, I was leading a training and talking to professors about AI and specifically about ChatGPT because that's what everyone wanted to focus on. And someone hit pause and they asked me a question. And they said that their students don't use ChatGPT or anything like that, but they use Grammarly. And I paused. I literally paused the conversation. And I asked them when the last time was that they went into Grammarly. And they said, oh, like 4 or 5 years ago. And my suggestion to them was go back into it. Go back into Grammarly, play around with it. You don't need a paid account. Just use the free account. Go in and hit that generative AI button. And you can still do this. If you have a free account in Grammarly, you can go in, you can write, you can hit that generative AI program, that button. It will open up a chat bot. You can generate things and just insert it right into there. And I actually had a later conversation with this person, and it completely floored them. That generative AI is worked into Grammarly. It has been kind of in the background for a while, all of those suggestions, but now it's really ChatGPT that's been trained for their own purposes. And I think that was a huge turning point for them because they knew their students were using Grammarly. They just didn't know that they could actually interact with a foundational model directly through that program. All right, so what I want to do is I want to show you a quick video. So this will not shock a lot of us, but I do want us to all have a little bit of a sense of how many of our students are using ChatGPT. So I'm going to walk you through what happens here. And this is how a lot of my students now are learning to use this program. So I'm pretending to be a college student struggling with the opening of Pride and Prejudice. So this is something we might teach in our literature classes, and we can adapt this activity for any subject we are teaching. So a student who's having trouble with it just has looked at the opening of the novel, just cannot figure it out. And they're going to copy and paste the opening from Project Gutenberg. So it's freely available on there. And they're going to get a mostly line by line analysis. So it gives them a basic analysis of some of the characters. It walks through some of the ideas. It might have frozen. Oh, there we go. All right. It gives some sense of how foreshadowing works, how irony works, and it gives them a pretty decent breakdown. And many of my students have been interacting with technology like this for a while, going into a chatbot saying, I'm struggling with blank, help me figure it out. And then really last year, my students started to say things like, explain it to me like I'm 5. Those sort of tricks, I think, are things that our students are using more and more. But what has changed, at least in my experience, is what happens next. I think our students are starting to really lean into follow-up messages. So here the student writes to his mate, this is good, but get deeper into the language. This is the big change. My professor wants us to do a close reading of the language of the text. And that's one of the things that my students are learning to do, that if they have a follow-up message, they can take whatever the feedback they have from me, however classes are going, and they can use that as information to get better and better information. You can see here, it does a pretty decent breakdown. It picks up quotes, it works through them, it gives a basic idea. So whether a sentence is sarcastic, whether it has numeric detail, what that means. Yes, and sometimes, as Zoe mentioned, sometimes they just upload instructions. Yep, that is part of it too. And yeah, and so a lot of this works only if a student is reading really, really closely and paying attention. Sometimes it happens, sometimes it doesn't. And then another way that my students are starting to use this technology is as a study guide. So you can see here, student goes in, gets a basic breakdown, nothing crazy, but does help the student along. Students need a lot of coaching to get to this point. And then here, student going in and asking about something from class. So that if I mention free indirect discourse, that clues them in to say, this is what my professor is looking for. I can further hone the response. And the last bit I want to show you, and I should come in a sec, is that students are increasingly, at least in my experience, starting to figure out how to use these programs as study guides. Oh, and Steve mentioned Cliff's Notes, I'm sure, is going out of business if they still exist. That's going to be a lot of pressure. And the big shift for my students is going to be the next message that pops up. All right, great. Now give me a quiz. And this is the kind of thing that is being worked into more and more AI tutors, right? Those are becoming really, really big and popular with our students. And so a student can go, if they're using this technology well and responsibly, they can go and generate this. They can generate practice quizzes and start to lean into this as a study guide. Now, some students aren't there yet, and some students are. So I want you to see that part. And so what I'm going to do, and I'm actually going to come out of my share screen for a moment, and I'll pop back in. So I want to hit pause there. And this is my chance to kind of let people jump in. So I can take maybe 1 or 2 comments if people want to jump in, or if they want to write something in the chat. So what do you think about this? Do you see students using it this way, or do you see use being slightly different? And again, if you want to, feel free to pop your ideas in the chat.
Also, students themselves are welcome to participate and, add your 2 cents.
Yeah. Yes, please do. Tell me if this is how you're using it or not.
Can I come in here?
Yep, hop in. Go for it.
Hi. I wrote this in the chat. That looked fabulous. I love the opening of Pride and Prejudice. And it's using it as a personal coach, a TA, however you want to call it. But there is that additional step that some of them might be tempted to make, which is, okay, all very interesting. I don't feel like reading all these things that you told me. Write me the paper. What do you do? For me, that's AI is great. It's a great tool. But especially, I'm interested in hearing what you say, Jason, about writing, because how will this affect the creativity of writing? the joy of writing. I'm a writer myself, and I use ChatGPT all the time as a helper. But I already know how to write, and I know what fun it is. What do you do with the 19-year-old who does not yet have it, or maybe the 20-year-old who never will love to write and will just use it? What are your thoughts?
That's such a great question. Emmy, am I pronouncing that correctly?
Yeah, you got it.
All right, cool. Yeah, I think it's one of the big questions. So one of the big things that higher ed needs to grapple with is what this means for the joy of learning. And my students are very worried about this too. I talk to them about this, that if they have a program that can create something like that, and theoretically, if they wanted to create a paper so quickly, so easily, why would they do it? Because one of the things that is true, one of the things we know about learning is that learning in many contexts works best when there's a little bit of friction, when it's kind of hard to do something. I find writing helpful and fun, but one of the reasons I find it helps me learn things is that I struggle with it sometimes. I have to sit there and I just have to think about something, and I have to put everything aside. And I just have to say, I have to just dive in and figure out how this thing is working. And what does this mean? What does this mean when students have a button? And Ethan Mollick simply calls it a button, where they can press it and it can generate things like this. I think that's something we really need to grapple with, because my students want to be creative. They're very worried about what happens with this technology for their creative side. I think there are ways to work in AI to encourage creativity, but we have to be very, very careful, because a lot of our students, they want, at least for my students, in some contexts, the non-AI space where they can just test things out and write and hover over stuff. So I think a lot of it is going to be talking to our students about how we learn, right? I think learning science, maybe not explicitly, but they want to talk about, if they do something like that, did they learn anything from it? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. And to their creative side, if they overly rely on these programs. And I have more to say about that too. Does anyone else want to jump in? And I can start working in the chat as well.
Wow, the chat is so active. I'm so impressed. So many interesting thoughts.
Yeah, I love it.
Just you mentioned something. Just a remark about your. I think it was your first question. Are we worried? To what extent are we worried? But what I found is in my classes, I teach English, is that, okay, of course, it's great because they can learn from it. Okay, they can use it to learn. What worries me is when they answer questions. Okay, not the learning thing, it's the answering question. And I found myself, perhaps in the last 6 months, is that whenever there's a home exam, a home assignment, it's just enough to grade one paper and all the rest are basically the same. I could give the same grade to all the assignments. What ChatGPT does is basically uses the same format and answers all, and then it has that way of summing up in the end, which is very unique to ChatGPT. And then here as a teacher, I really feel I'm stuck. I know they've learned something, but I'm not sure I'm grading their work.
Yeah, I think that is a huge question. If you look on social media, it's kind of pushed to the side that we want to, and I'll end with this question too, we want them to be able to practice their critical thinking. And one of the things that worries me about this technology is we can do, great things with this tech once we feel good about our own voice. I feel like I can interact with ChatGPT, Claude, Gemini in a way that doesn't lose myself. But I'm 37. I have all of this experience that's bolstering me up and all this confidence that I've learned over time and just with feedback and just playing with things. And I worry about, even with our students, right? If you're 18 years old and you're not confident and you're still coming into your voice. And then this is given to you as a solution. Right? How can we as educators encourage you to take the hard route, to do the hard work, to go through and do your own work? And there is no easy solution for this. And I think that's step one, recognizing that that's going to be very, very complicated going forward. And I want to pick up on, and your name is Elaine, right? Is that pronounced correctly? All right, cool. So, and I don't want to make it worse, but I am going to show you one more video because it picks up on a lot of what we are talking about. I'm going to share my screen again. Here we go. And it should keep sharing my sound, hopefully. Yep, there we go. All right, so this is from TikTok.
This is how I summarize hour-long lectures in seconds with AI. This lecture's 58 minutes long. We don't have time for that. But do not worry because AI is going to summarize this whole thing. Let me show you how. First, just copy the link to the lecture you want to summarize. Then it's as easy as pasting the link into mindgrasp.ai. Then instantly you have notes to the entire lecture. It even provides you with a summary on all of the key concepts. You can even ask specific questions from the lecture and it'll give you detailed answers like these. This literally took me a couple of minutes and I summarized the entire lecture with ease. We all know how pointless lectures can be, so save yourself the time and use this tool.
All right, so, oh, we went too far. All right, so now I'm going to come back out and now I want to hear some perspectives. And for this one, just throw them in the chat because I do want to honor its time. And it's about, 10:40 my time. So what are your responses to this? And so this picks up on a lot of what we've been talking about friction, about what happens when you have a button, right? And this is going to happen more and more. You have a button where you can just click it and it does something for you. It generates a paper, it generates an idea. What do you think? What are some thoughts about this? And just feel to write them in the chat and I'll address them as I go along. Yes, Bruce says, we all know how lectures are useless. Yep, so one of the reasons I show you this video is that from the student side, there are a lot of assumptions here, a lot we can learn. The student doesn't see lectures as valuable. And so this is why they're looking for the shortcut, right? They're basically looking, saying, I can spend an hour of my time doing this or more, or I can do it in 10 seconds. And as Konstantinos mentioned in the chat, there's the threat to creativity here. And that threat is real. I'm not going to belittle it. I'm not going to undervalue it. It is real. It is something that I think that as colleges, we need to think a lot about what this technology means for creativity. Yes, and as Danielle asked, what is left for human intelligence then? And how can we as educators encourage students and ourselves to sometimes take the hard route? And we are not immune to this, right? This is just a human thing that when we have something that takes 3 hours to do, and then we have a way to do it in 5 minutes, a lot of us will choose that 5 minutes. In principle, we'll choose the hard route. But when push comes to shove and say we have a deadline or something happens or there's an emergency and we need to find shortcuts, a lot of us will do that. And so I think that we need to think about that. And I am looking at the chat too and trying to work. And I'm not going to get to all of them because it's so active, but I'm trying to get some of the big ones to stick out to me. Yeah, and as Elena mentioned, this is a serious threat to bad teaching. And I want to come back to the idea of bad teaching and teaching that thinks about pedagogy a little later. And I love Elaine's question here. I actually want to add it to my slides. Is creativity turning into productivity? That, is that shift starting to happen when we're starting to see less of a value put on just being creative and more on just doing things fast? And Noah, I know you raised your hand. I'm sorry, I might not be able to get to you. I'll invite you to kind of dive in later if you want. But I do want to make sure I honor everyone's time. And Bruce said, yeah, that's what employers might prefer. And that's something I want to come back to too, that there's a way in which colleges and industry might have slightly different interests, and that's okay. I think a lot of going forward is going to be figuring out where colleges fit into it, and it might be adopting AI in a way that businesses do, or it might be a slightly different route. For a lot of us, it's going to be a different route. It's going to be a route that focuses a little bit more on creativity. So I'm going to start sharing my screen again, pop back into the slides, but I like being able to actually see your faces, which I just don't see if I'm sharing my screen in the same way. All right, so the other trend I mentioned is a skepticism to easy solutions. And again, this is one of the reasons that the search for easy solutions is one of the reasons that people really like AI detectors. Because if you could rely on them, if they were good, if they were accurate, you could plug them into a course and keep everything as it already was. You don't have to transform. You don't have to rethink things. You could just teach a paper in the same way we were 5 years ago, but you could have this other side to it. And I think that's changing. I do not use AI detectors. Oh, about my monitors. Yeah, I need to play with that. But anyway, yeah, so I do think that is changing. That I think that there is this rise of distrust in AI detectors, and that could be a good thing. I think that could be productive. I do not use them. I think there's a lot of research that says we have to be very, very careful if we use them at all. That there's a lot of research about the bias built into them, that they are biased towards non-native English speakers and everything like that. And so, and the other part of this trend is that I think that more and more institutions are moving beyond bans. I was actually surprised by how many colleges, even a few months ago, were trying to really ban something like ChatGPT. And we still see that every once in a while, trying to push it out of classes, push it out of institutions completely. And one of the things that I tell educators is that it's not really possible to ban these products because, as we've talked about already, they're being baked into everything. ChatGPT and Claude and everything else are being baked into more and more products that our students are using. And so if you really try to ban it, what you're doing is you're not really banning it. You're basically issuing a gag rule so that students will likely still use these programs, but they're just not going to talk about it. And there's something very disempowering about that actually makes it harder to figure out how to go forward. Yes, and as John mentioned, that it's even being baked into library databases. It's being baked into colleges' everyday operations. And so I do think it's going to be a question of what is the practical way to move forward? And I think that that's becoming the focus on practicality, the focus on strategy. I think this all comes to number 3, the rise of a more nuanced approach. That we need to figure out a way to really think about where our students are and what our students need and use that information to move forward, as opposed to just falling victim to the ease of just saying, we'll just ban it and we don't have to worry about it. So I don't think that, at least for me, is a practical way going forward. And so I actually want to start to wrap things up and give you a quote. And we might have heard this before. Feel free to write some ideas in the chat. So here's the quote. We'll experience more technological progress in the coming decade than we did, little typo there, in the preceding 100 years put together. So write some ideas in the chat. What are your ideas about this quote? Does it seem accurate? Oh, Alan says, true, I give up. I hope we don't give up. I hope it's more empowering than that. Gina mentioned likely. Yeah, so I'm mostly seeing agreement for sure. Agree with this. Julie just says scary. There's something very disorienting about that kind of change. Yeah, so keep the chats coming. Please keep putting them in. I think that there are a couple of things to focus on here. One is that this is very likely, right? It picks up on ideas of Moore's law and an even more extreme version of Moore's law, as mentioned in the chat. And then there's also a lot of emotion built into this idea that if our students are coming to us and they're signing on basically for 4 years of education and now increasingly 5, what happens when a student comes to us and by the time they graduate, the world is fundamentally different? It's one of the big questions. The student is with us for 4 years. They might go in thinking, I want to do this. And that job might not be there in 4 years or 5 years. And so there's a lot of questions here. And it's anxiety producing for us, for any educator out there, but also very anxiety producing for students. That's a lot to deal with. If you're in college and going through and focusing on whatever you're focusing on, you're going into this world that is going to look very, very different. So there's a lot of guidance, I think, that needs to happen there, and a lot of just exploring and thinking about it. And this leads us to some huge questions, and I'm not going to answer these. These are huge questions that I think that colleges are starting to circle around, some more than others. So the big question, and we start to see this percolate in the chat responses, is how can colleges assess student learning? How can we move forward? And I think that because we're seeing this distrust in AI detectors, and that's a good thing in many ways, or productive thing in many ways, starting to figure out how we can use alternate forms of assessment. One of the big trends over the last year has been the rise of project-based learning, been the rise of experiential learning, right? These focuses that take us away from, say, maybe just writing a paper for every class and every assignment, but these other forms of assessment that might be harder to just overly rely on AI for. So I think that's becoming more and more of a focus. I actually think question number 1 is now the hot button question. What does this mean for assessment? That is something that now is becoming so heated and so thought-provoking in the higher ed space, whereas a year ago, it was just, how can we ban it? I think we're moving past that and now moving to this more productive question of what this all means for assessment. Question number 2, how can colleges continue to encourage deep learning? There's a way in which college and higher ed is very countercultural. Culture says, do things faster, do things quicker, right? Get them done, right? If you can do it in 10 minutes versus 10 hours, do it, go on to the next thing, right? The internet, social media, and everything else that's happening around us forces us to go faster and faster and faster and faster. Then, for a lot of us, students come to our classroom, we say, hold up, slow down, just pause, think, reflect. Maybe it's worth spending 10 hours on that thing. And that's going to be one of the big questions. How can we do that? How can we encourage value in deep learning, slow learning? Sometimes human brains just need time to process. The other question is, and there's an ethical component to this, how can colleges prepare students for life and work? In my mind, we have an ethical obligation as educators to help students make sense of things, right? To get them ready to have jobs and to have productive careers. So the question is, how do we do that? How do we do that in a way that still gives our students a safe space for practicing coming into their own voice? I think that's huge. That's a huge question. Oh, there we go. And here are some ways forward. And feel free to write comments in the chat, and we can talk about it at the end. It's 10:50 on my time, so I want to give everyone a chance to kind of pop in some more. I think there are a couple ways that we're going to see for moving forward. One is going to be focusing on metacognition, giving our students ways to think about their own thinking. I think that's going to be huge going forward. The second way to do this is to have a combination of foundational skills and AI literacy skills. I think that if we focus on completely one or completely the other, I think we're losing a very valuable part of what it means to be human in 2024 and beyond. But we need to find ways to encourage students to really lean into those foundational skills and then find ways to have AI augment them. I think that's going to be one of the big questions too as we move forward. And then also, I think the idea of being a generalist will become more and more valuable. College, for a long time, has been about becoming an expert in one thing. Now, the liberal arts model gets us away from that a little bit, right? A little bit more being well-rounded. I think it's going to be really leaning into that, right? Giving students a way to think about what it means to be a generalist right now. If they're going out and getting a job and they have an AI assistant to help them out, being a generalist might be the way to go. Now, that's sort of complicated too, because we also want expertise built into that. And if we want to talk about that, I'm more than happy to. But there's a way in which, really focusing on how being a generalist is going to be more and more necessary going forward. Last thing I want to say is the principles of teaching and learning haven't changed. What has really changed is how we do it, the methods that we use. But experiential learning, right? Huge thing right now. That's not new. Project-based learning, not new. Scenario-based learning, not new. These are all really, really valuable ways for moving forward, and they have been around for decades. A lot of what I think is going to allow us to move forward is going to be thinking about what the learning science says, how we actually learn and how we teach, and leaning into that, right? This tech is only tech, right? It might be changing the world, but the way that humans think and process is actually very kind of slowly moving in some ways. So I think that it's worth focusing on the continuities here, that we can lean into what we already know works, and then it's a matter of just having a tool on top of that. And above all, students and educators, we have to talk. This is not happening nearly as much as it needs to. That we need to have these spaces where students are not just given a voice, but are given action, are able to build things. I think that students should be creating solutions alongside educators, administrators, and everyone else, that they need to be worked into the committees, the councils, whatever task force colleges have, that they should have students on them. And they should be empowered students. They should be able to come in and actually have a role in the shaping of the college and the university. That's what I think. I think that needs to be step number one, having those conversations. I think without that, it's going to be very, very hard moving forward. So I am done. So if you want to reach out to me, and this is my very, very quick and easy call to action, reach out to me. Send me a message. So on here, I'm going to send so it's a QR code. I can send the chat. I can send the link in the chat if people want it. But on there, you have my email. You have some of my social media stuff, a couple other ways. You have the ability to reach out to me. And please do. If this works, if it was useful, please feel free to take it as a chance for an ongoing conversation. I want to help people out. I recognize whether you're a student or a professor or administrator or anything else, just a person who's interested in this. I recognize this is tough. This is a really, really hard thing to adapt to. And step number one needs to be, at least for me, collaboration. It needs to be conversation. It needs to be working together as much as we possibly can. All right, and I can pop that up again later if people want, but I do want to come out of share screen because we have about 5 minutes to talk. And I know I didn't get everything with the chat, so that I was kind of pushing through the last few slides. But if people want to hop in, you're more than welcome to ask me a question or give me a comment if you want, or pop something into the chat and I'll try to get it if I can.
Can I comment something?
Yes, go ahead.
So, Jason, thank you very much for your presentation. However, I think I totally agree with you on the last one, that the principles of teaching and learning have not changed. What has changed is the how. And in my opinion, the how is not to place in two different camps the old way and the AI era. In my opinion, as a teacher, I think the best recipe is like to integrate on my way of teaching in the classroom the new technologies. So it's not opposite things. I think that the things comes as the time comes. Then the old thing comes and you need to integrate the new technologies into your pedagogies or whatever you're using. I will give you an example. I'm saying to my students, when my students, they come to ask me, what are you going to place in the exams? I said, like, no, I have no idea. Whatever I have teach, it's going to be part of the exams. But from the first lecture, I'm telling them, keep notes. And when you write the notes, back to your notebook or to your electronic notebook, try to identify what kind of questions or what are the important things in order to read. This creates their creative thinking. If now you are going to use the AI tool as a new dimension, then you can combine what the machine proposes, like this guy that he placed in 10 minutes that he kills because he's using one aspect, the creativity. So you can combine the creativity, what you are creating, what are you creating, and what are you thinking during the lecture, during the process, and then the machine will propose you something. In this way, you are building the creativity and you are building your confidence because you are learning by yourself. You are creating what is more important according to you, so you are the protagonist, and at the same time, the new tool reconfirm. So they are not two opposite campuses. It's like one should integrate the other. This is my opinion.
I think that's a great point, and it's huge. I think that it's going to be about balance. It's going to be figuring out how it all fits together. And this is the hard work. It's actually very easy to say no AI or full AI or whatever else. But what's really difficult and productive is figuring out how it all fits together. And there are different ways to do this. One quick way of doing it for anyone who wants to do this is if you have an assignment, say you have a project a student is doing, and this is created by Leon Furtz. He has an assessment scale. So if something should have no AI, he gives it a 1. If it's full on AI, he gives it a 5. And so for an assignment, he might have multiple things along the way. So if a student is free writing, that should be a 1. That should be all of them. It's not productive if you have ChatGPT doing it for you, because it's all about your own thought process. If you're planning, maybe you can do a 2. Maybe you can have that kind of collaboration, right? And then probably not many 5s along the way, depending on the context. And so that is one way of trying to find that balance that Konstantinos is mentioning, that even for any individual assignment, there are some ways that students might want to use AI and sometimes they might not. And a lot of it comes down to using these as tools, but still holding on to deep learning and creativity and critical thinking. Because that's the threat. The threat is that students won't lean into those as much, but we really need them to. But I think that it's going to be, a lot of it is going to be about balance. And you're right, not thinking about in terms of old and new, but thinking about how it all fits together.
And can I comment 2 more things?
Yeah.
First of all, productivity does not mean, fast. Productivity means to create something with an impact in the fastest way. So it's not, to do something fast. Because if you are doing things fast, you need to come back and do the double work if you are not doing well.
Right.
And the second thing about creativity, in order to create, to boost your creativity, you need 2 templates. What do you know and what is proposed? If you are going to get only what is proposed, you are not building creativity. If you stay only think that you know everything, then you kill your creativity. So it needs 2 contrasts. It needs a contrast. What do you know and what is offered?
Yeah, and giving students, at least for me, giving them a voice and autonomy in that. So my students actually really know when they start to lose themselves. They're very good about saying, this is where it no longer sounds like me. It sounds like ChatGPT. I think it's worth leaning into those moments because they're very anxious about that too. At least a lot of my students are. And someone else can pop in if you want, or you can pop it in the message and I'll try to get to it. Yeah, as Mary mentioned, most students are there to learn. They're paying to be there for a lot of them. And that helps too. Yeah, and I too love Konstantinos' point about productivity and that question of impact and what that means for our students, wanting to create something of impact in the fastest way as you can. And you're right, that's a much better way than what I talked about in terms of being speed. So thank you for that. I'm gonna use that going forward because I think that's important.
And to answer to Alan, you can take the best example that I can give you is research. What you are doing in the research laboratory. When you are producing something new, it's original, like in research. So if you can produce it very fast, you are the innovator and you are the reference point. You are getting a lot of citations. This is the closest answer that I can give to a colleague.
As long as you can identify originality in
research is originality. If you
without using those tools, you realize that professors can be duped. so easily, we actually don't know the animal hiding. I'm not being pessimistic, I'm being quite realistic. We just don't know.
There is a methodology, the 5 how. And the people are hired not because of the CV, but they are hired when you discuss with them. So the physical contact is there in order to check if it's something original or not.
Okay.
And I want to wrap up. I want to bring up one thing that Christian wrote as a way to kind of wrap things up. This question. So Christian wrote, as educators, we should know that it's up to us to change the system. Learners will use technology to exploit our outdated didactic approaches. We are the ones who need to change. So when we think about AI, at least for me, it's not something wholly new. What it really does is it scales human action. And one of my worries with AI is that it's going to make it easier to replicate bad teaching. And I think we've already seen this, right? You can create just a lot of multiple choice questions faster. You can grade standardized testing faster. You can lean into these forms, which may not be the best depending on the context. It makes it easier to do them. So for me, it's going to be about taking a step back, thinking about if we are actually teaching in a way that is pedagogically minded, or if we're teaching in a way because we've just done it for 10 years or more. I think that's the big push. That is something that is good that can come out of this technology, because educators, I think in general, our feet are being held to the fire. We need to think a little bit about what we're doing and whether we are giving students, friction, right? Because it's useful for them and they need to kind of lead through in order to learn something, or because it's just the way we've done things for a long time. So having these pedagogical conversations are huge.
Thank you very much, Jason. We will appreciate everyone's time, and thank you for joining us live. And we will follow up with some more discussions. Impact project is going on. Thank you, Kostas, for your contribution, and thank you all very much. And have a great rest of your day. Goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you, Jason. Much appreciated.
Bye-bye. Thank you, Jason.
You're very
so
welcome.
much.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason.